There we go. Okay. The aftermath of the Sugar Act. So the protests that came from the colonies, I think it was, I said 8 or 9 colonies sent formal economic protests that talked about the impact the Sugar Act would have in the colonies after 1764. These protests were largely ignored. Parliament believed, as the king's advisors, in this case, the advisor was George Grenville, the prime minister, they were well within their rights to legislate. Most of them thought in all matters whatsoever, whether it be a revenue measure or whether it be a simple act of monitoring and regulating trade, which is where the Sugar Act fell. We know the details of the Sugar Act. It cut the tax on foreign sugar, but the enforcement was going to be there. Okay, the colonists continued to find ways to avoid and circumvent the Sugar Act. They were good at it. They had a 100-year history of smuggling and avoiding paying what they thought were taxes that would hurt them economically. There were already rumors that Grenville wanted to pass not only a Sugar Act, but a revenue tax on stamped paper, which had been operating in England for almost 100 years. I think going back to the 1690s, the English people had paid a tax on stamped paper, including newspapers. Why did they pay a tax on stamped paper? Well, it was a revenue measure, obviously, and it also was a way to keep track, as far as the English government was concerned, of those who were publishing newspapers. And so you couldn't publish your paper unless it had been printed on the stamped paper. And if you said anything the government didn't like, again, this is not a free press as we have now. It is limited to where you could be sued, you could be shut down if the government didn't like some of the things that you said. Again, not as liberalized laws about an open and free press as we have today, and we expect to be the case of a free press under the First Amendment. So it had more than one measure, but it also was a method by which the government in England raised revenue. They had to place the burden of the debt and the taxes of the nation on the English people. This reached down and affected a lot of people, as the colonists were going to find out. So people in the know, the colonial agents, right? These are effectively what's the word we were using. The lobbyists knew that this might be coming. And there were rumors swirling in the colonies about a stamp tax going and applying to the American colonists sometimes in 1765. The intuition came from Grenville, who stated, this is Grenville's words, "It may be proper to charge certain stamp duties in the said colonies and plantations," unquote. It was going to apply to the mainland colonies and the British West Indies colonies, the Caribbean colonies. They were going to be subject to the Stamp Act as well. What he did, of course, was postpone enacting legislation. So, and this playing devil's advocate and undoing some of the prevailing wisdom of the imperial school of the American Revolution. Schools of thought, hint, hint, are something you should be familiar with when you're considering the exam answers, which we've covered going back. So keep you honest and make sure that you look at the first content the first couple days of class. But the imperial school of thought goes back to this idea that the English had a conspiracy to deny the colonists the rights of Englishmen. That clearly isn't the case. And we see that argument undone by what Grenville was doing ahead of time. He was giving the colonies an opportunity by asking them, the colonial agents, and later what he also did is he asked the colonial governors, okay, do you all have ideas of how to raise revenue in the colonies? And they're all thinking like, no, because that's kind of your job. And we don't want to kind of come up with suggestions, because if you're a governor of a particular colony, suggesting a tax within the colony isn't going to make you popular. And you've got to work, of course, with the colonial legislature. So he, at least to his credit, asks them for ideas in 1764 to try to sound them out on this idea. Maybe the colonists can come up with their money on their own. So how is that going to work? Well, sometimes they talked about by population. So some colonies would pay more. What would your fair share be if you're New York versus North Carolina, a traditionally wealthy colony and a not as wealthy colony? How would that be apportioned? Each colony's responsibility, and that was surely going to cause rivalry and hard feelings in between the colonies. Maybe they could vote within each colony's legislature, because as some of the colonial agents and governors, mostly the colonial agents, reminded Grenville, that revenue measures were voted on within each colony. And they were very reluctant to raise revenue because that meant taxing the people. And then they brought up the principle that's pretty obvious to us today, that revenue measures, whether they are in Parliament, the people's representatives, and England wasn't perfect, 11 million people and about 200,000 people had the right to vote. Not exactly democracy by our standards. In the American colonies, that proportion of people who could vote was much higher. We think 50 to 75% of eligible males could vote because they own property in the American colonies. In England, it's maybe 20, 25%. So the principle of revenue measures starting from the people's representatives was time-honored and cherished in England. Only problem is they can't squeeze the English taxpayer for more revenue in the form of taxes. So it's going to have to come from the American colonies. And so these ideas were put to Grenville, and the governor said, yeah, the whole taxes to generate revenue idea isn't going to be a really popular one. So he said, okay. So they gather information, Grenville's deputies, about the reception, the possible reception in the colonies of this Stamp Act. The Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York representatives of England living in the colonies were polled about the mood. How would the reception be to a stamp tax in the American colonies? One Connecticut gentleman flatly told London that a stamp tax would be a critical mistake. Here's his quote: Americans are, quote, filled with the most dreadful apprehensions from such a step's taking place, from whence I leave you to guess how easily a tax of that kind would be collected. 'Tis difficult to say how many ways could be invented to avoid payment of a tax laid upon a country without the consent of the legislature of that country, and in the opinion of most of the people, contrary to the foundation principles of their natural and constitutional rights and liberties, unquote. Folks, this is the argument the colonists will put out right there. All of it checks off all the boxes in the protests that will form over the Stamp Act. Legislatures set revenue measures. The colonists have no representative in Parliament. So obviously it falls on, and when he says countries, he's talking about people identified first with their colony. So the people's representatives would vote on that revenue measure, and yeah, revenue measures like that aren't ever really popular. So in other words, said differently, Grenville is proposing an idea. He's asking a question he knows the answer to already. A revenue measure isn't going to be popular, originated from Parliament or originated from the American colonies. Can Parliament under the Constitution do this? And Grenville really isn't ready to talk about and discuss and argue over the constitutional niceties. He's one of those folks who thinks, yeah, in all cases whatsoever, Parliament can legislate. It can over the trade. The Sugar Act is constitutional and legal. So is any kind of Stamp Act. To Grenville and Parliament, this kind of attitude that the colonists wouldn't react very well to a Stamp Act make it more necessary to pass it. You have to consider that in Parliament there are a lot of hardliners who say, ever since 1763, the colonists need to pay their fair share. This makes sense. For the defense of the colonies, this is what this revenue measure is for. What's the problem? I mean, you have things like members of Parliament saying, and using the metaphor often, it's the parent-child relationship. I mean, these are like rebellious teenagers, and that type of idea is discussed again and again in the 1760s. These folks made their way to the American colonies, have benefited from everything about living in the British Empire, and now they won't pay up. The flip side is what the colonies are saying. We took all the risks and left an oppressive England for either economic, political, or religious freedoms that we couldn't achieve in England. We hacked it out of the wilderness, burying our families and kids along the way, but all this time we never surrendered our rights simply by crossing the Atlantic. Oh, that is another rich constitutional question. Are you in a secondary status because you're a colonist, as opposed to someone who's in England? Some English people living in the American colonies say yes, much to the horror of their fellow Americans. Either you're born in colonies or you're born in England and come in some capacity to the American colonies. That's the other thing up for debate. Thomas Hutchinson will say that, oh, and those words will come back to bite him. Benjamin Franklin said he's a colonial agent representing Pennsylvania, but speaking for a lot of the colonies. Again, the guy that's got the pulse on what's happening in the American colonies. He's the one who comes back with the idea that, look, I regret that the uneasiness there is among these colonists to this measure, but it is Franklin who says, at the end of the day, I don't see it any other way. You're going to have issues with a revenue measure on stamped paper. Colonial agents simply reminded Grenville what he already knew. Colonists tax themselves. One went so far as to say to Grenville, why would colonial governments exist or even meet if Parliament could just pass revenue measures? Good question. This matter, they reminded Grenville, was controlled within the different provinces. It's the duty of the governor and the assembly. The governor, in most cases, is appointed by the king. What are there, 8 royal colonies in 1765? The others are a couple of are elected, a couple are appointed because they're representatives of a certain family, like the Penns in Pennsylvania. But the interests are very different. Royal governor is appointed by the king, the People's Assembly chosen by the voters in that respective colony. They butt heads a lot, and the colonial assemblies had asserted their prerogatives about what they could do in each colony more and more during the 1700s. And it's the royal governor who said, I'm in a tough spot. I've got to work with these assemblies. Folks pass the laws in England. I've got to make sure that they apply. So that's where we leave things. One brave member of Parliament actually stood up and said, when the Stamp Act was read in front of Parliament in 1765, early 1765, his objections only stiffened the resolve of many in the House of Commons. Some people, again, the Sugar Act sails through without really any opposition. The Stamp Act passes with about 80% support in the House of Commons, unanimous support in the House of Lords. Not that they vote on it, but they just give it kind of their blanket approval. But it's interesting, from like universal support for the Sugar Act to a couple people standing up in the Commons and saying, I hope you're ready for what happens next. But those who hear those objections think, oh, we'll be ready. And it's almost daring the colonists to form protest or to really form a constitutional argument about why they shouldn't pay a Stamp Act. And that's where this story takes us. The protest that starts in the colonies is interesting for a couple of reasons. We can evaluate, again, the principle by which colonists frame their response. Parliamentary taxation. Is this something Parliament can do? Or is a revenue measure something only left to the individual assemblies? The second fascinating aspect of understanding the Stamp Act is that how prominent men in the colonies used the mobs that they needed to make sure the Stamp Act is never enforced. News of the Stamp Act, stamp tax, again, here in the notes, orienting ourselves, arrives in the colonies. It passes, I believe, in March 1765. And what Parliament does when they enact the Stamp Act as they say, it will go into effect in November. So you've got a lag of what's that? 8 months. March to November 1765, by which the mechanisms to have the Stamp Act in place and enforced are going to be there. Not the least of which is that every colony has to have a stamp agent. And considering you get, I think it's about almost 8% of the revenue. 8% of the revenue that your colony generates from the Stamp Act goes into the pocket of the stamp agent. This means jackpot. Great job.
So it's like the tax collectors in biblical times.
Sure. I mean, absolutely. And it has to be an easy job. This is going to, let's talk for a minute about how the stamp tax reaches into an entire layer of society that is not affected by the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act were about the impact it would have that many colonies were still in an economic depression in 1763 and 1764. A couple of legislatures in the colony said, I'm not sure the Sugar Act is constitutional, but most people back when they read the protests from the colonies kind of just guffawed and laughed at it, saying this is ridiculous, absolutely not true at all. Okay. Simply stated, the Stamp Act requires all valid legal documents to carry a stamp. That's how it works. Newspapers were included, as they were in England. Playing cards. Playing cards is nothing sacred. Well, stamped paper. Licenses, insurance policies, even, dice. Couldn't sell these items unless they appeared and they weren't legal, unless they had the stamped paper. And the stamped paper was going to be printed in England, sent to the American colonies. I mean, divorces, wills, deeds, legal I mean, if you didn't trade in sugar or molasses, you weren't a merchant. The Sugar Act, it's like, whatever. I mean, maybe some things I buy might be a little bit more expensive. But the Stamp Act, you can imagine, you don't go through life in 1765 or 2020 without needing legal documents of some kind. You're going to come across them in your life in one form or another. And you're going to need people who can, once again, we have stamp now, right? We have notaries. So it's not exactly the same thing, but in many cases, to show that it is legal, it has to have that. An officer of the court, a notary public, or whatever you use in that capacity. Okay, so that's where the Stamp Act is going to reach into the folks in the different colonies. By late spring, the first organized reaction takes place to the stamp tax in the colony of Virginia. And that colony is, of course, the legislature is called the Virginia House of Burgesses. Let me pull up the, where is it? Thought I had it. There we go. Okay, so the Burgesses, this is where the origin, again, what we're going to see is two methods of protest take place. We're going to see one in the form of, let's see, all right. Sure everybody can see that. Those of you on Teams, can you see the slide? Someone tell me who's connected with us. Yes, no? Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir, I can see it.
Okay, good. All right, let's go through here and let me advance this a little bit. I wanted to show you a slide of, this is a death in the stamp tax, right? This is Patrick Henry. The House of Burgesses resolves and approves the first set of what they're called the Virginia Resolves, which emphasize the colonial objections. The right of taxation was limited to the people or their elected representatives. That's essentially what this new member of the Burgesses said. This is Patrick Henry. The Virginia Resolves essentially said that the people have the sole right and ability to create taxes. And the translation to that is only Virginians tax Virginians. That's what Patrick Henry is saying. The man who organized what are popularly known as the Virginia Resolves, after they're passed and reprinted in colonial newspapers. Henry had been a failed shopkeeper and tavern proprietor, opened a bar except no one paid their tab, so he went belly up. He was a farmer, that didn't work. Shopkeeper didn't work. So he, of course, took the profession of everyone with 3 failed jobs in the past, a lawyer. Sorry if any of you want to become lawyers. Lawyer jokes will abound this semester. But it's significant that Patrick Henry learns the law very quickly and doesn't argue on the merits. He, in fact, is very talented, even in 1765, at arguing about the emotional side of the case. Henry had made a name for himself in Virginia over something called the Parsons Cause, which happens at the very end of the French and Indian War. Let me give you a little background on that, and it's important to understand Patrick Henry. This is the Patrick Henry who will later thump his chest after the Intolerable Acts and say, "Give me liberty or give me death." So Patrick Henry is first on the scene in 1763, 1764. A background to this story is that in Virginia, Anglican ministers, the official church of Virginia is the Church of England, the Anglican Church. The Anglican bishops and ministers, I'm sorry, there are no bishops in Virginia yet, even though it seems like a lot of people are threatened by that prospect, especially in New England and Massachusetts. It keeps them up at night. So Virginia ministers are paid in tobacco. Tobacco is currency. It's used for bills of credit by tobacco planters large and small. You send your tobacco back to what's called a factor, which is an agent back in Scotland or England, for which you make purchases. You get bills of credit, where you can buy slaves, land, or more increasingly, if you live in Virginia and you're very wealthy and the tobacco product or crop is good, you buy items, finished goods, luxury items. A lot of Virginia planters are in debt by their own creation. They've tried to do the keeping up with the Joneses idea, and they've gotten themselves into a never-ending spiral of debt. So there had been a drought in the 1750s, which drove the price of the plant up. The demand is constant, the supply wasn't there, and the supply couldn't be met, or the demand couldn't be met because of the drought. So there was an idea in Virginia that ministers expected to get more because the actual supply was low and the prices would be going up. Instead, the House of Burgesses stepped in Virginia and reduced their pay, the pay of the ministers, to 2 pennies a pound. And a lot of folks said, I don't know if the legislature could actually do that. In fact, the king himself, the king can do this, vetoed the 2 Penny Act, it was called, that adjusted the pay of the Anglican ministers and how much tobacco they got. The king vetoed the act, and some of the clergy, some of the ministers in Virginia said, well, they reduced our pay. They couldn't reduce our pay. We're going to sue for the money we should have gotten when the pay was higher. Back pay, in other words. We're going to sue for back pay. Patrick Henry was the lawyer that was going to defend the Virginia House of Burgesses over the principle of the back pay. Henry's job was to help the jury determine how much in damages should be awarded. So they were going to get the back pay, apparently. Patrick Henry stepped in and said, well, why argue the merits of the case? Let's attack the king and the clergy himself. Patrick Henry is still in the process of learning the law. Folks, there's no formal law school in 1763 and 4. How do you become a lawyer? You follow a lawyer for years, and you become a lawyer. You know, there's no bar to pass. There's no degree to get. You become basically a student, an apprentice of a lawyer. Henry went to the very well-known tactic of ignoring the legal niceties and attacking the clergy. He had made them, the clergy, the enemy of the people because they demanded their back pay. He finished with a flourish when he addressed the jury over the back pay issue and how much the back pay should be. A king, he said, by disallowing acts of this salutary nature, far from being a father of his people, degenerates into a tyrant and forfeits all rights to his subjects' obedience. Treason, treason, you start hearing among members of the jury and in the court. I mean, this was bold stuff he was saying. The king forfeits all rights to his subjects' obedience. What the hell did he have to do with the whole thing about the back pay? Nothing. Nothing. Luckily for Patrick Henry, his father was the judge in the case. All politics are local, as they say. And so, to no one's surprise, the jury sat nodding in agreement while Patrick Henry was berating the process by which they might have to get back pay. They are spellbound by his oratory, which has nothing to do with the issue at stake. The wronged ministers are awarded damages of 1 penny apiece by the Virginia jury. That's what puts Patrick Henry on the map. This, folks, happens before he stands up in the legislature in Virginia to address the Stamp Act. So that's where people know him from. Henry introduced in 1765 in the spring the protest known as the Virginia Resolves in a very clever manner. Let's see if I have a slide for that. Yeah, here's a representation of what the Burgesses would have looked like, complete with, at least at this representation, you see audience members and folks from the community. I'm not sure if that was actually the case. We do know that Patrick Henry took advantage of a situation where many of the Burgesses decided the day had gone on long enough. They were going to try to adjourn for the afternoon. Some of them thought this was the end of the session and they wanted to go back to their respective county or parish or home. And that's what they were getting a head start on. So you have, in other words, a rump. The term rump means a fraction of the full membership. So those that remained stuck around, and Patrick Henry knew that the older, experienced members of the legislature had left. He was left as a freshman member of the Burgesses. He's the guy with others who have to keep the longer hours, do the work, prove themselves. And this is the kind of thing that works to his advantage. They're mostly, these resolves, high theater, but they have deeper effect. The Virginia remainder legislature passes the 5 resolves. And then when the other members get back, because they hear about this passage, those that hadn't fled town, they vote a couple of them down. But the newspapers in Virginia and then the newspapers in the other colonies make it seem, remember, perception and reality are 2 different things. They make it seem like all of the resolves, even the more radical ones, that question Parliament's ability to pass this revenue measure, went through. They did not go through, but the newspapers printed as if they all had. Perception and reality, 2 very different things in this case. So if you were in Massachusetts, if you were in neighboring North Carolina, you looked at the newspaper and there were probably about 18 to 20 newspapers, I believe, in the American colonies in 1765. All of them would have to pay to publish under the Stamp Act. So as far as you were concerned, this is what went through. You know, it's a little like, we'll talk about this in the future. If you've ever seen the Paul Revere engraving of the Boston Massacre, you know, this showed up in newspapers as far south as Charleston, and you were like, holy crap, they're gunning down people. The British Army is gunning down, murdering people at point blank range, because Revere just made this brilliant piece of propaganda. As far as you were concerned, this is what happened, because you saw it right there in the newspaper. The fact that his engraving is riddled with inaccuracies didn't matter. Didn't matter. The perception and the reality, 2 different things. Well, someone who was in this audience is a 22-year-old student at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson realizes that this is moral theater. He's in awe of Patrick Henry for a couple of reasons. First of all, he can't believe that this guy is this weak on the arguments and still is just spellbinding with his oratory. He's also jealous. Jefferson is never, as much as we connect him to, obviously, the founding and his significance, he's not the guy who stands up, thumps his chest, and says these kind of things. He's a backbencher who quietly speaks People often complain they can't hear him speak when he does speak, and he's a skilled writer. But even Jefferson, throwing aside the emotional arguments that Patrick Henry is making, understands the significance here. It's an incredibly powerful argument, even if he doesn't really always discuss the theory. Now, what these measures do. So Virginia leads the way. Virginia leads the way over the way to protest the Stamp Act. Okay, we'll go back to the notes here. Different colonies take on different ways to show their protest. Some of these measures, the Stamp Act measures, the details of the law, do something that the English probably didn't want to happen. They end divisions within colonies, East versus West, court versus country, factions, meaning the city versus the outside areas, the more rural areas. That's what's happening in Massachusetts. North Carolina is being divided over multiple office holders. Well, a lot of these differences are being put aside as the Stamp Act drove factions further and further apart. In some cases, people put aside their differences in 1765. So Virginia paves the way for how you might launch assaults against Parliament's actions. Massachusetts did it a little bit differently. The violence starts in Massachusetts. Here, the lightning rod is Thomas Hutchinson, Chief Justice of the colony, later also to be Lieutenant Governor of the colony of Massachusetts. He had been the enemy of James Otis. Otis we talked about in discussions of this Sugar Act. He was the one who protested the writs of assistance even before the French and Indian War ended that allowed Crown officials, the customs officials, to have wide-ranging and open-ended search warrants when they were looking for goods that had not paid their taxes and specifically the impost duties. That already exists in Massachusetts in 1765. Worse for the Hutchinson family as far as the optics, using a modern term, a modern political term. How does this look to everyone? Doesn't look good if you're against the Stamp Act and you see that members of the Hutchinson family, specifically Andrew Oliver, his brother-in-law, cue the dun, dun, dun music, would be named the stamp agent for the colony of Massachusetts. Small groups of men had an idea how to prevent the stamp duty from happening. Scare Andrew Oliver away from the job. Brilliant strategy. These men begin to organize themselves, because there were 9 of them, into a group called the Loyal Nine. They want to enlist, of course, the aid of mechanics and what we would today call blue-collar workers, which is just about everybody, unless you're a lawyer or official in government. Later, they would take the Loyal Nine as it expanded and adopt a name that did not originate in the American colonies. We might be surprised to find out, but a member of Parliament named Isaac Barry, when he was addressing the Stamp Act impact in the colonies, called those who would protest it Sons of Liberty. And that's how we get that organization, formed in Massachusetts, in Greater Boston, and then in other colonies as the protests expanded. They included a shopkeeper, artisans, a printer, and they planned to make the protest public in the form of a riot. And luckily for the people of Massachusetts, and specifically in Boston, they had a tailor-made riot waiting to happen. In fact, they had a riot just about every year. To carry the protests to the streets, they combined the forces of the North and South mob, rival gangs in Boston that would get together. Let me show you what we're talking about here. We're going to open up the share tray again, and here we go. I think I've got slides of the people who were involved, because Not only do we have Thomas Hutchinson, the book on Thomas Hutchinson that was written, and this was a while back. I think this was in the 60s or 70s. The book was called, there he is, The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson, a book about Hutchinson, which it was an ordeal. He's going to be connected to this story from 1765 until he's finally returns to England on the eve of the American Rebellion. There's Samuel Adams, one of the members of the Loyal Nine, later to be the Sons of Liberty. Benjamin Franklin's testimony. There's Patrick Henry. Let's see here. That's what the stamp paper would look like, by the way, once it went into effect and carried the stamp. The stamp indicated it had paid the tax, and it was then a legal document. Sorry? GR?
Oh,
It's Latin for the King of England.
okay.
Yeah, Georgius Regis. Yeah, something like that. I'm not exact with that, but there's Andrew Oliver. Hutchinson again. Okay. Here's a pop culture reference I hope that some of you know. Remember the 5th of November? Okay. See, a lot of my pop culture references completely, because
I don't get that part.
okay. V for Vendetta, the movie.
Ah,
Okay. Guy Fawkes Day.
I have heard of that.
Okay. In November 5th, every November 5th, the North and South mob in Boston marched on opposite sides of the city. Then when their paths crossed, they just started an outright street brawl. And that happened on November 5th. This good-natured stick and brick throwing ended in 1764 when a young child was killed. Somebody usually died in the melee, but a young kid was actually a casualty in 1764. So this group thought, instead of the whole, mob action, fighting and everything else, why don't we just channel this into a protest against the Stamp Act? A group made up of Boston's working class, craftsmen, sailors, apprentices, young boys, and organized by the Loyal Nine, employed a clever tactic. Make the enemy not the other mob, but Andrew Oliver, the opponent of the two mobs. And that's exactly what they do. Critical in this organization is the previously mentioned failed brewmaster and sometimes bad tax collector Samuel Adams. Wasn't very good at it, but he was good as a person who riled up people and got folks organized. So instead of fighting each other, they decided to go after Thomas Hutchinson and his cronies. The rumor was spread, which is completely untrue, that Thomas Hutchinson had personally recommended the stamp tax to Parliament. This is patently false. Did it matter? Nope, didn't matter at all. So the fun started when they actually found a stuffed effigy of Andrew Oliver found in a tree. An effigy being like a scarecrow version. Someone had clothes, they would have stuffed it with straw or hay, and they would have put it up on somewhere near a tree. This is August of 1765. Hutchinson, as the leader of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, orders it to be taken down. The sheriff says basically, no thanks, I don't want to die today. And who's going to be the guy who goes to cut down the swinging effigy of Andrew Oliver, the stamp tax collector? He refuses. They leave it on the tree. Then the Boston Street Theater really takes off. The mob pulls down the effigy and marches to the governor's residence in Boston. On the way, they marched to the building that Andrew Oliver owned on the dock. He, among other things, was not just the stamp agent. He had a profession. He was a merchant in Massachusetts. They called this building, that was his place of business, there in the port of Boston. The mob rechristened it the Stamp Office. It was not a stamp office. It had nothing to do with the Stamp Act, but they just saw it as the symbol of Oliver, the stamp tax, and they took the building down in 5 minutes. Destroyed it. Utterly destroyed it. The effigy of the stamp collector was then beheaded and stamped. By that, I mean the mob took turns jumping up and down on the beheaded effigy as they made their way to the next destination, in their protest. Just like the tax, they stamped it, and then for fun, they burned it. And then they moved from Oliver's place of business to his house. They found that the door to the residence was barricaded. That was one of the last things Andrew Oliver did before he abandoned the home. They called for Oliver's death. He was, of course, long gone at that point. The governor, go ahead.
March?
Yes. I mean, they would do things in Boston, like call up, the man there's no police force. Let's remind everybody of that. So you have a sheriff, and the sheriff has limited powers, what you think a law enforcement officer in our modern times would have. But you can't have the officials in the colony call out the militia. And when that was attempted, the answer they got was basically, everyone in the militia is in the mob. Well, someone said, well, let's get the drummer boy to beat the drum. There's some kind of emergency within the town. And the response to the sheriff, who said, let's get the drummer boy out to get people's attention, was, sir, he's in the mob too. So they couldn't even organize any kind of method by which they were going to stop this protest, which, yeah, it did become violent and it targeted personal property. The governor ordered the colonel of the Boston militia, and in fact, the soldiers who were going to be in the militia, ordered them to call him out. And as I said, they could not, because all of those who were the available officers and drummers were even gone. And then he said later on, if I even tried to get someone brave enough to beat the drum and get everyone's attention, one of the things that would happen in the city was that people were very afraid of fire. So often you would hear shot ring out or bells ring or the drums. And then they said, well, look, even if we tried to get someone out to beat the drum, the mob would destroy the drum, and that would be the end of that. So Hutchinson's turn came later, after they destroyed Andrew Oliver's home. There's the effigy of the stamp agent. This is Hutchinson's residence in Boston. He is the poster child for corrupt politicians in the colony of Massachusetts. He got his position by who he knew and not what he knew. And again, there's a history that goes back. He represents the court faction, the enforcement of the laws, the one who said at the end of the French and Indian War, why are loyal British people in Boston and greater Massachusetts trading with the enemy? We should stop this. Now, if you want to stop smuggling, you're taking a risk. You wouldn't think you are, because you're just enforcing the law, but he was. And that put him on the radar in 1762 and 1763. So this is several years. Okay, he stood up as the person who wanted the aggressive searches and seizures and looking for the so-called contraband items that had not paid the taxes and had been smuggled from the French colonies into Boston, Massachusetts. Okay. Hutchinson's turn now happens. He holds many offices and city in the colony. As I said before, the rumor hadn't died in the city that he had actually called for the Stamp Act to be put in place. That really hurt his reputation. It is not true, but it didn't matter. The mob gathered in late August, shouting, "Liberty and property, liberty and property." When the governor started hearing the chants, liberty and property, he says, I know this means one thing. And this is the quote from the governor of Massachusetts. Quote, "It's usual to notice of their intention to plunder and pull down a house," unquote. Liberty and property, meaning we're going to go after someone's liberty and probably their property as well. They made their way to Hutchinson's home, and the mob took a special joy in destroying the inside and outside of the Hutchinson residence. Papers, plates, furnitures, walls, piece by piece, were slowly and methodically dismantled. Even the slate roof was pulled off. Hutchinson was long gone, of course. Things settled down the next day. So much so that the town meeting apologizes for the actions of taking the house down and dismantling it. Only pulling down the house, not the violence and the riots up to that point. So the protests were okay up to a point, and then when they went after his house, not so good. So, to summarize, by late August 1765, two American colonies, Virginia and Massachusetts, expressed outrage at the Stamp Act. Remember, folks, it hadn't gone into effect yet. It ain't even November. And in August, we see two of the oldest English colonies. Virginia starts. That's one way to do it. We don't see the same riots and mobs in Virginia, but we certainly see that in Massachusetts. The visual and well-publicized action was sure to spread to other colonies, and it did. By the end of 1765, the lower houses of 8 other colonies approved resolutions which denounce the Stamp Act. These resolutions are interesting in what they say, the argument. Now, there's no coordinated effort. No one yet meets. We're going to talk about the Stamp Act Congress, but the representatives of the different together and saying, all right, how do we form a unified front? What do we say? What phrases do we use? They don't. These colonies are writing individual protests going back to Parliament. And among these 8, they categorically deny the right of Parliament to tax the colonies for revenue. Okay, next set of notes, we're going to continue the protest. In other words, they're figuring out a way to make sure the Stamp Act can't work. How do they make sure it doesn't work? They essentially deny the ability of the English to actually carry out the Stamp Act. Make it work, in other words. Okay, let's see if we can pull this up now. All right, and notes, these are the Stamp Act protests that we'll start to, and then we'll eventually next time get to the repeal. Let me pull this up so that everyone can see it. We'll go to the share tray here, and let's see. What does this say here? This is, nope, this one. All right, Stamp Act protests. By August, 2 colonies expressed the anger at the Stamp Act. It started a fire. Would it spread? This is the unknown. Now we're into late summer 1765. Virginia and Massachusetts had took the lead. Boston especially had provided a model on how to deal with the resistance to the stamp duty. If we can say the protest of the Sugar Act was limited, it becomes much more involved now. As I mentioned before, hatred of the Stamp Act permeated all social groups in the colonies. The Sugar Act, might not bother me, but legal documents. I mean, dice, cards, they're taxed as well. The anger was directed at one group in each set of colonies. So Boston provides the framework, right? How do you make sure that the Stamp Act is a dead letter? Make sure that the stamp agent doesn't do his job or doesn't want to do his job. Bingo, you have your answer. You target your equivalent of Andrew Oliver in your respective colony. By the end of October 1765, all but 2 have decided to resign to save their life and or property in that order, or not that order.
I would have too.
Exactly. And how can we fault these individuals? In Georgia, this is probably the only colony where it has a chance of being enforced. The man appointed arrived and quickly got a sense of the mood in colonies. Remember, these are folks who are either in the colonies or going to be appointed and leave from England to go to the colonies. So the man who's appointed gets a sense of what's happening already when he gets on the shores of Georgia. They passed stamped paper to customs agent. Literally, he says, oh, this is the reaction to the Stamp Act? Don't want the job. He hands the job off to the customs agent, and then he fled the colony of Georgia. I'm out of here. His successor has the best chance in all the colonies in Georgia. Why? There's actually a small military force there. There's militia and there's some British soldiers, because remember what Georgia's reason for existence. It's a colony that's supposed to protect, once upon a time, supposed to protect Carolina from Spanish Florida. So as the newest, still newest English colony on the mainland, it seems to be maybe the only one. If you have a military presence, you can use the soldiers. Not going to make you popular, but you can, in theory, use the soldiers to make sure the stamp tax is collected. The New York appointee tendered his resignation even before he was officially named and the stamp paper arrived, because he didn't want to see his home and his store of goods dismantled in public. Again, I'll go through some of the examples. The New Jersey designate waited a bit longer, but he also quit, and it found that quitting the job got the ire or disappointment of the royal governor of this colony of New Jersey. That was William Franklin, the illegitimate son of Benjamin Franklin. The papers in New Jersey told the collector that you should insure your house for property destruction now. And so that was essentially the cue for him to possibly not keep the job. In New Hampshire, the distributor tried to disembark in Boston. That's where he sailed into New England. The mob refuses to let him once they hear stamps were on his ship. He was arriving in Boston to take the job in New Hampshire with the said stamped paper. He sends a letter to the mob. I mean, you can imagine this guy sailing and seeing what I will now call in future discussions the pitchfork and torch crowd, right? They got the pitchforks, they got the torches, and he's like, what the deuce is going on here? As he might have said. And some people might have said on the ship as he's sailing into Boston, oh, that's the angry mobs. They heard you're the stamp collector. He sends a letter to this group before he even gets off the ship. I quit. I don't want the job. The mob then carries him on their shoulders to the local tavern to celebrate that he had quit the job. There you go. You can't enforce the Stamp Act if there's no one there to enforce it. In Rhode Island and Connecticut, the battles became not only over the Stamp Act, between the different elements or factions. They didn't like to use the word parties, political parties, factions, interest groups within each part of the legislature. It only drove those factions apart about who was going to make sure that the Stamp Act was enforced and those that didn't want it enforced. Both colonies were divided on local issues, jealousies between the cities, the favoritism of who got the jobs in the colony. It seems Connecticut was still fighting about the effects over the Great Awakening and how they would organize the curriculum at the college known as Yale, which was a protest college because a lot of people didn't like the way they were doing the instructors of the Congregationalist ministers in Harvard. So they created in 1700 Yale College. Jared Ingersoll was supposed to be the designate in Connecticut. He's not much liked by those wanting to reform Yale, open new land in the countryside in Connecticut. When the Connecticut mob was not able to attack Ingersoll, they settled for the next best thing, his assistant as stamp agent. The crowd surrounded the house and told him not to travel to the capital and get his commission. This man wrote to Ingersoll, his assistant, and said, I'm not going to accept the position after all. You put political pressure on people, threaten them personally. One distributor, a very stubborn stamp distributor, refused to cave to the mob until they showed up to scare him. What they decided to do is capture him, essentially kidnap him, put him in a coffin, nail it shut, dig a hole, and threw the man into the ground. All the while asking, you still want this job? This guy held out till the part where he was in the ground inside the coffin, and he started hearing the dirt hit the pine coffin that he was nailed inside. At what point do all of your nerves break? Well, he held out a long time. Not just the kidnapping, being thrown in the coffin, hearing it nailed shut, lowered in the ground. No, I never. And then when you hear those shovels of dirt, right? When you're in the ground hitting, as you're laying down in the coffin, and he's like, okay, I'm done. And that's when they pulled him out of the ground, and he quit the job. there's nothing worse than maybe being nailed into a coffin until, of course, you realize you're actually going to be buried. At this point, the man began to shout that he resigned over and over again. We can see how men who are supposed to be assigned this, at one point, enviable task. I mean, with pride, you would say, I'm going to be the stamp agent of Connecticut. Not so much by the fall of 1765. When the Connecticut mob surrounded Ingersoll's house, he says, I can't quit until the governor accepts my resignation or tells me I have to quit. In the meantime, he gave the mob all the stamp paper that he had and said, feel free to burn this if you'd like. And that's basically what they did. In Massachusetts, we begin to see the appearance of an anonymous author. This was very much standard operating procedure in the colonies. If you wanted to protect your identity, and if you wanted to often make connections to historical figures or someone who, if you wanted to invest authority in a person. Later, there's going to be protests about the Townsend duties, and they're written by a man, and the title of these protests are Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. Why did he call it Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer? Because people don't pick up newspapers and read something called Letters from a Pennsylvania Lawyer. They're like, blah. And so, oh, a farmer. Okay, like me, because everyone basically does farming of some sort. So what would you do if you didn't want to, you wanted to protect your identity, you wanted to protect your family, obviously, and not be controversial, and maybe you would come up with a simple name and a simple profession and invent an identity. This is what this individual did. A writer calling himself Humphrey Plowjogger hoped to put pressure on the people who could change the law and get it repealed. That's folks in England, merchants and the people who worked for the merchants and manufacturing business in England. If they could put pressure on the English lawmakers, the Stamp Act, which is never going to go into effect because there ain't a stamp agent around to collect it, but could more importantly be repealed. So, Humphrey Plowjogger, if the British workers were thrown out because they couldn't work, they were unemployed, if they should riot, so much the better, argued Plowjogger. He said he would, quote, rather the Spitalfield Weavers, and obviously there's not a real town, I don't think, named Spitalfield. That's an unfortunate name. But he was just making a reference to a scenario he hoped would happen. I would rather the Spitalfield Weavers should pull down all the houses in Old England and knock the brains out of all the wicked great men there than Americans should lose their liberties, unquote. The real person behind Plowjogger is a 30-year-old Harvard-educated attorney named John Adams. John Adams, not Samuel. In 1765, John Adams begins to bombard the Boston Gazette with anonymous writings on liberty. He's not the firebrand hothead his cousin Samuel is. He's more of an observer than an organizer, but he energizes the people in Massachusetts. Adams was also privately watching what he called the new kind of politics. Some of it was good, some of it bothered him. Colonists were not going to let the stamp tax ever be collected. The resignations were done for better or worse, sometimes by threatening people's personal property. He wasn't sure that he exactly liked that part, but everyone he recognized was united on this issue. Not even the last war against the common and historic enemy France were putting people together like their resistance to the Stamp Act. People, he said, even of the lowest ranks, unquote, were involved. This idea was not lost on his wife, Abigail, who is as connected and has her pulse on what's happening in Massachusetts. Women, too, she told John, had stood in crowds. They had watched the effigies burned. They had demanded the stamp collector to quit. The Sons of Liberty realized immediately the value of having women in their organizations. They began to alienate royal officials, and that wouldn't happen if those who were the consumers, those who bought the products from England would stop doing that. What we're getting at here, folks, is the idea of boycotts of British goods. Was there an organized boycott over the Stamp Act? No. But some communities thought it might be the best way to stick it right back to England. Listen to what Plow Jogger said. If we can make the English people unhappy, if we can throw out of work those who make the stuff that we buy, that's the way to get the Stamp Act repealed. Next time we'll see whether or not they were actually effective or not in that. How the Stamp Act comes undone, what Parliament will have to do next. If they were to repeal the Stamp Act, do they put something in its place? Had the colonists won the constitutional issue over an internal tax versus an external tax? Soon to be determined. And the man who had brought the Stamp Act wanted more enforcement of it, Grenville. He's gone, however. King never really trusted him. There's going to be new leadership in Parliament over the Stamp Act. To get more of a pulse about what's happening in North America, they bring in the colonial agent of Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin, who says, I'm as surprised as you are, but I kind of warned you that this was going to happen.